Hello, I am Duncan Idaho 11, aka the Foundry author Gorgonops, and today I'm going to be taking you inside the Foundry to take a look at a upcoming map and show you a little bit about how I built that. So a little bit of insider information and general ramblings about this sort of thing. Feel free to chime in on the chat. I should have that up, provided anyone actually wants to chime in on that. So at any rate, though, we'll just go ahead and get started with the solo view and take a look at what's going on inside the Foundry. So right now, it is an empty ground map. Fortunately, I've built more, so we're not just going to watch me build a Foundry mission today, because there's no time in the day for that. But we'll go ahead and show off what we can do with something like this, which is a completely blank slate. So the mission in question that I'll be going over today is my last Starfleet security mission in Season 2. It's titled Refraction, and it's getting close to done. So hopefully once the Foundry comes back in full, I'll have that out for people. So anyway, this is what we got. An empty ground map, completely flat space. New thing provided in the Foundry, and it lets us basically do anything we want. So let's just go ahead and get back to the editor. So if you're going to work with some space like this, you kind of notice a big problem with the backdrop, which is basically that you got all these little 5 feet, 5 feet, 5 feet markers. So the one thing I'll show you guys how to get rid of is basically that, just for anyone who is interested in working in the Foundry, any Foundry authors out there, just to show, hey, this is how you get started. This is the square one. Then we'll go ahead and show you square 10,000, basically, after all the little tweaks you can go on for making a map. So the first thing we want to go ahead and do is just cover this thing up. Nice, easy process, and it actually gives us a little bit of customization ability. So we've got these foundation block objects. So these little doohickeys, which are very, very useful for making miscellaneous architecture. What we're going to go ahead and do is place one down. There we go. And it's down. So just going to adjust the coordinates a little bit so we get a perfect fit on this guy. So it's generally 0, 0, 0. You start off on that first block. Then you just hit the handy dandy duplicate button. This little doohickey right there. And we get a second block. And we can just move that into position there. Alrighty, very exciting. 152.4 should set that up in the correct position. And 0. Yep. 0.0 gets us that. So now we've got 2 blocks. You can see where this is going. We're going to have 4 blocks. And that will completely cover up the base map and allow us to start things off and build something up, just completely from scratch. So the reason you would want to do this versus some other type of map is if you really want control over the terrain, or you really don't want to worry about any terrain whatsoever. Another, hopefully this won't be a long-term benefit, but the empty ground map also doesn't suffer from many of the lighting 2.0 bugs that are currently in the game Star Trek Online. So if you're wanting to build a mission, say, right now, and really not have to worry about it, just building it using all empty ground maps would be an easy way. But fortunately, we don't have to really worry about that over the long term. So the last thing so you see, I got my little base map down. I'm going to drop it by the maximum amount possible, which is 15.24, and you'll see what that does when we get started. So I didn't adjust the spawn point, I didn't do anything like that. Setting it up like this will basically create a perfect cover for the entire map. So you can expand this out a little bit more if you really want to have a full playable area, but this way you really get to have the most out of the empty ground map, and by using different foundation blocks, you can actually set this up as different types of environments. So I just used type 4, which is just solid black. It's just kind of good if you want it there to just completely obscure the background, so it just basically looks like a nondescript black background, which doesn't hurt the minimap at all. But you can do things like set it up with tile with pavement bricks if you really want to sort of use this full area to make a city, or one of the other types as well, since there's a few that could actually service as a city backdrop. So in general, oh, okay, so Drogon is with me. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn on the streaming view, get the chat room in there. So my little very very improvised little chat log there. So there we go. We're on the stream. I won't be able to see that when I'm in the editor, but there we go. I'll check back on it occasionally. So anyway, you're going through the long load process because this is a completed mission, so we're going to go through whatever technical gubbins the Foundry needs to go through in order to get the mission into a playable state. So again, right now we're not doing anything with the map. We are just setting it up. We're just spawning in, no objectives, so there we go. Our completely flat terrain is still flat. We just have a more workable backdrop that we can incorporate into the mission. And as we can see on the mini-map in the upper right, there's no 5-foot markers. So this makes the empty ground map completely versatile, and it only takes 4 foundation blocks to do it. So let's go ahead and get started with seeing something I made earlier. So the map we're working on today, or showing off today, I'll also go through and show a little bit of the backdrop as well, is an empty ground map which I've really basically reached a state of completion. I've used the complete object budget, I've changed the backdrop, I've added objectives, dialogue. We won't go through any of that today, but we'll just show off what you can do with this empty ground map. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and just play this. I'll go through some of the objects once we actually see what they are in 3D in the full editor, but we're just going to go through and take a quick walk around, show what's going on with this one. So I've added a bunch of stuff, and this is now something that's a completely custom environment, save for using all these little cryptic pieces. So I guess background on the mission is that it's another revisit of the planet I created in my first Starfleet security mission. So this would be the second revisit I've done on that one. I wasn't happy with the first one that came out because that got complicated for personal reasons. But this mission is basically a lot more sort of a full attempt to go back and flesh that place out, work with it in terms of the characters, work with it in terms of the story, and really kind of make it feel like a much more vibrant living place. Because it was a little token in SSF-8. I'll just say that. So we're getting back to a little bit of Gemini and doing a few visual callbacks as well. Although this environment is going to be completely new to anything that was seen in Gemini or Continuity, that 4th mission. So the one thing I'll just say for the subject of revisiting a location is that it's good to kind of go back, keep to a consistent visual style, play off some of the old iconography that you may have made for that mission. But one thing I'll say is that from working on this myself, I found it very gratifying to try to create new environments for the place. So always try to push yourself creatively to try to create new environments. So here's our first little bit of dialogue, but what we're going to do today is just close it. So we aren't going to go through the plot at all. That will be revealed for the 4th when this mission is actually published. But for now, we're just going to take a look around and also get rid of the bridge officers. Hide them in the boxes because they're not necessary right now. So all my holograms are going to go away. So anyway, this is the mission. So we've got a custom Skyfile backdrop. Basically it's not the default one. I just select one of the other ones. I believe this is Brea, which was used in one of the Romulan arc missions. So it's got a little bit of a nice fog effect, nice soft lighting, which helps obscure the fact that I'm using the large hillsides from New Romulus. Colony connector pieces, large trees in the background, and all those took lots of iteration because these are large single rocks and they're really good on this type of custom ground map where you don't have anything on the horizon line to obscure the horizon. You just move that up there and it looks like we're in a much larger environment now, even though we are still on that empty ground map. The trees in the background, a little bit of a visual flare, help break up the rocks and give it a little bit more texture. We're going to walk over here. This is a custom building I've created just directly in front of me, next to some default buildings, which were very cheap for the asset count. But this is a place you investigate later. We've got a couple of security holograms, security force field, so the mission is about opening that place up. So right now, we're just going to take a look, and we've got some water here, and we've got more miscellaneous background scenery, which I've added there behind a wall to, again, give the place a feeling of more space, more connectivity in the environment, like this is part of a much larger environment. I could have just kept adding rocks, but I dedicated a few assets to opening this up and giving it a little bit of a visual flair. And I'm just going to jump off real quick. So I'm in the water. The water is I added identically to the, I added the foundation blocks. There's just 4 pieces. I structured them the exact same way and raised them, I believe it's 1.5 meters above the environment, to create this little retention pond. So right underneath the water here is the foundation blocks that I laid down right at the start of the mission. So everything else I just kept adding on and on and on and on. And one great thing about the empty ground map is that it's really easy to keep track of the vertical height, because if you're using a standard map of terrain, you have to worry about setting everything to 0, finding a 0 altitude for setting objects up, and worrying about finding the 0 first, working that out by trial and error, and then getting started and having to worry about, when you're placing objects down, of discontinuous terrain. So one thing I'll recommend for working with the empty ground map in an environment like this, it made it really simple and actually a bit quicker to build than if I tried this on a standard outdoor map. So we've got a bridge piece here, we've got tiling laid down, we've got some characters with optional dialogue, but generally though, this is basically just a way of connecting these 2 big blocks together. So I'm creating the illusion of a connected city. And one little thing I've done, this is lighting 2.0, I've added these small little recessed floor lights to give it a little bit more texture. So that's one tip for working in the Foundry since the Lighting 2.0 update, is that you can use the ESD recessed and ceiling lights just to basically take a flat surface and give it a little bit more texture, especially when it's shaded in like that. Because now you got a nice little lighting effect, and a plain block has a little bit more shape, a little bit more color going on with that. So we're just going to keep walking around. So a bunch of stuff, lots of crates. On a map like this, you got to be real careful with the asset count, because you're building everything from scratch and you want to add as much as possible to the backgrounds, the interiors, I'll be showing off in a minute, and all this other detail. So I used lots of crate groups and tried to basically space them out so you get a lot of small, like wherever you look, you basically get a little bit of something. So I tried to basically avoid having the player be able to look around, see a building, see a block, and then that being the only 2 things. So the crates are basically there as sprinkles. A little bit of color, a little bit of light, a little bit of breaking everything up, and it also fits the backstory of this location as being more of a commercial area. So you get the feeling that there's, in addition to basically people living here, you get a little bit of business going on. So all these buildings here are Cardassian buildings. You see a little bit of something on the far hillside there. That's another building that I've basically just elevated and made it look like there's a little hilltop monastery type thing, using one of the Vulcan buildings, of course. But one thing I wanted to do is build some interior environments. And the only way you can really do that is to use building wall pieces. Actually, building wall pieces are the easiest way of doing that, because you get these short little wall sections, and you can build interiors and upper levels pretty easily. So here's a little glass window, so let's go ahead and walk inside. And the office attendant immediately says, "Hey, what are you doing here?" But we're the Foundry author, so we can just go wherever we want right now. So at any rate, though, here is the interior environment. It's a little administrative building. So we've got a little bit of technology going on, some custom lighting effects too, some of those recessed ESD floor ceiling lights, some ESD architecture, and that's basically it. With a new lighting system, you don't really need to do as much with adding various pieces together, just because or various pieces of lighting together, because you get these single lighting objects that are capable of generating the lighting source. You don't need to place a redundant OmniLight too. So once the Foundry is fully back online, all the bugs, or most of the bugs, are fixed. That'll actually make it a little bit easier to build, because custom lighting becomes a little bit more accessible. So that's the first story. So this is a 2-story building. Now, to put this together easily, I didn't want to try to incorporating a stairwell into that building, so I did cheat a little bit. I just put it right behind it. So first I built that interior in full, then I added this back ramp up here, laid a floor right on top of that, and then built this. So in the 2D editor, basically the floor below me was completely obscured, so I was able to build this up as I would any other custom interior. So now we got this 2-story building, built relatively quickly, relatively easily, having to make a little bit of a conceit with the fact that the ramp is leading to the exterior. It's not incorporated with the interior below. But again, this was very efficient and worked pretty well for generating the rest of the map. So we've got custom NPCs, we've got all those placed around. Some are using the legacy contact animation and just going through a cycle of 2 randomized behaviors. And then we've got another NPC which we can have optional dialogue with. We've got a wall, we've got some objects in here, and we've got a couple more contacts which are relevant to the mission. And a little cheap railing section. Railings are actually one of the harder things to do in Star Trek Online because we don't have a small, flat, horizontal piece that works really well for that purpose. So what I actually did, I used the top of colony lamps. Got their height just so the little wire running between light bulbs is effectively serving as a bit of a balcony, while the pillars themselves seem like they're adding a little bit of support, a little bit of structure to this patio right here. So altogether, that's basically the most of this map here. So you get a good feel for how this looks in the in 3D. So we're going to go back to the editor and take a look at around at some of the finer details. So just go ahead and save. So here's our basically here's our hillsides. Now the hillsides themselves, again, they're relatively easy to put down at first, but to get them at the right height and to get it looking right, you do have to do a lot of tweaking because it's hard to appreciate how these guys look in 3D from the 2D shape. You just see this irregular form. Some of those some of that's pretty round, some of that is sloped, and to get it looking like a natural terrain, it does take a little bit of work, especially with one aspect. If we take a look at this guy is 58 meters in the air, in the Y coordinate. That took a lot of trial and error to try to get that right. So one thing to appreciate with these guys is that even if you're very comfortable working with the rest of the editor, the new Romulus hill pieces are pretty finicky just because they're really big and it's hard to because of the scale you're working with. It's hard to just get a good feel for, like, at least in the first attempt, for how high these things should be. So the sort of the foreground pieces I've actually lowered quite a bit. Just because it sort of provided a nicer slope because at the very base they're usually pretty flat or recurved. So by lowering them down a little bit, you sort of blend them in a little bit better with the terrainscape. So then you have a next level back up from that, which gives it a little bit more texture to the top of that hill. Those are really high. And if you're really struggling to get that right, one thing I'd recommend is basically placing a line of those down and then making a really big gap. So for example, I could just duplicate this object if I was really not sure, wanted to check out what was going on. Of course, I put it outside the map, and I've got too many detail objects, so we're not going to be able to do anything with this. But then I would just go ahead and say, set this to 80. And then basically work by trial and error and say, okay, I've got a line of 3 of these, for example. So I say I have one at 80, one at 60, one at 40. I can immediately appreciate which one is in the best place. And then basically work from that. So like, okay, the one on the right looks best. I'm just going to go ahead and either stick with that one, put it where I want it to be, or I can actually start doing a little bit more of a fine detail adjustment. So if you're working on any height issue, that sort of iterative process where you basically set it up, so set up like basically a scale for yourself, and then just try to take care of it in one go. That's generally what I recommend, because otherwise you're in the process of tweaking one item up, down a little bit, and that can take many more load cycles to get that right. Same thing with the trees. So these guys happen to be 30 up because they're relatively sort of in this little depression here, but I've got some that are actually obscured right now because these chose to layer down below. Now let's take a look at the ones down here. These ones, though, just because you're working with a different section of that big block, those are 80 up. And again, that takes a process of trial and error, especially when you're working with an irregular object and trying to get that connectivity with the rest of the between the tree and the mountainside, so you're not basically dealing with anti-grav trees. That's generally the way you really want to work about that one. So, at any rate, though, so we've got these basically you see the real up close here. This is basically this black space here is basically the end of that the terrain that we had on the empty ground map. So just right beyond that, I've set up a few buildings here, separated by a wall. The player can't get over here, but this creates a little bit of that backdrop, creates a feeling of that there's this larger continuous settlement outside this basin. Exact same thing going on here. So I chose the largest, tallest buildings possible, and I also played with their height. So this one's a little bit higher than the actual terrain because that elevates the building up. You see a little bit more of that. And even though if the player was able to actually look down, it looks very nonsensical, especially with the fact that this is blending in with another type of building. That generally gets you a really good look and good feel for that one. So, with that, that was the Kofal settlement ground map for SSF-8 Refraction. I might go ahead and stream some of these other maps that I've got here, depending on how long downtime is. Or I can just go ahead and actually start building something up from scratch. So that's kind of the ultimate before and after, what you start out with, what you end up finishing with, and hope it was at least slightly informative. So we'll be putting on... Oh, wait, hold on. I'm just reading the chat room right now. So, Old Fat Gamer asks, how are you able to make 3D map out of 2D? Editor just amazes me, especially interiors. Oh, yeah. It's basically, you get a really good feel for it. So, it is one of those things that's a little hard to describe when you're actually thinking about it, because you have to first worry about, okay, we've got a floor, and we want to make that a continuous entity. So that's simplest done if you try to keep everything on one plane with a full custom interior. After that, you basically want to put your wall sections, and that actually creates a pretty intuitive space. So you can look down in the 2D, you have your floors, you have your walls, and you have everything that you put in there. Generally, I take the last step is putting the ceiling on, because once you put that ceiling on in the 2D editor, it basically covers everything up. So when I'm done with a map, I'll basically put everything except the ceiling, because I'm able to visualize, I'm able to think about it, and then I just slap that last ceiling right on there, and I got my space. Once you sort of get through the process a few times, you can start playing with verticality. So you can have stairways, you can have second levels, but it is something that is, it does take practice, it does take work, and it does get easier, but it never is strictly easy, because with the Foundry, it does take a lot of work, because you are responsible for basically all these little fine details. You have all these objects, and you have to get them lined up the right way, or else you get small little gaps, you get things interpenetrating. So, yeah, it just basically takes an eye for detail. So, I guess with that then, I'll go ahead and end this particular stream. So, real short one. No real building, but we'll get into that a little bit later. To avoid pushing things, basically. So anyway, though, thanks for joining me, and I'll have this up on YouTube if you didn't catch the whole part. And with that, happy foundrying. Oh, credits. So anyway, Duncan Idaho 11 was my gamertag. You can find that on YouTube, and my Twitter account is @gorgonos_SSF. So get in contact with me there if you have more questions, concerns, anything, feedback, yada, yada, yada. And with that, I'll go ahead and end the stream.